Blood on the snow leaves a trail any tracker can follow, but a heavy downpour washes the world clean. Mud and storm clouds were Freya's only allies the night the Alpha King severed their unspoken bond. He stood at the high altar, his golden eyes locked not on her, but on her delicate younger sister. He claimed a fragile queen, entirely ignorant of the royal twins already growing quietly in Freya's womb. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply vanished. Stick around to hear how a discarded shadow stole a king's entire legacy. Incense burned thick in the cavernous expanse of the great hall, a cloying, desperate mix of frankincense and charred rosemary. The priests always burned too much of it during the solstice rites, trying to mask the scent of 300 restless, unshifted wolves, packed shoulder to shoulder. It never worked. Beneath the holy smoke, the air tasted of roasted mutton, sour ale, damp wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of territorial anxiety. Freya stood near the back, her spine pressed against a rough-hewn stone pillar. The cold of the granite seeped through her simple linen dress, a grounding anchor against the dizzying heat of the room. She dug her fingernails into the calluses on her palms. Left hand, right hand, a rhythmic stinging pressure. It kept her breathing steady. Garrick stood at the dais. He looked massive in his ceremonial furs, the pelt of a monstrous dire bear draped over shoulders that had borne the weight of a fractured kingdom for 5 bloody years. His dark hair was slicked back with scented oils, catching the torchlight. He smelled of pine sap, crushed mint, and the rusted iron scent of his own inherent dominance. It was a scent Freya knew intimately. She knew how it intensified when he was angry, how it softened into something like warm earth when they lay together in the hay-strewn shadows of the outer stables, far from the prying eyes of his council. They had an understanding. Or so she had thought. Tonight was the choosing, the ancient rite where the Alpha King bound himself to a mate, solidifying his bloodline. Freya had spent the morning scrubbing the dirt from beneath her fingernails, attempting to tame her coarse, unruly hair. She was a warrior, a scout who knew the borderlands better than she knew the reflection in her own looking-glass. But tonight she had tried to look like a queen. She shouldn't have bothered. Garrick held the ceremonial binding cloak, woven from spun silver and white fox fur. His eyes, usually a warm amber, were flat and unreadable as he scanned the crowd. The hall plunged into a suffocating silence. Only the crackle of the hearth fires and the raspy breathing of old Lord Harbeck broke the quiet. Freya let out a slow breath, parting the crowd slightly, stepping into the edge of the light. She met Garrick's gaze. For a fraction of a second, the amber flared. A muscle feathered at his jaw. He saw her. He knew she was there. He knew what she carried, even if she hadn't found the words to tell him yet. Her hand instinctively twitched toward her flat stomach, where a strange, heavy warmth had settled over the past month. Then Garrick looked away. He didn't just look away. He severed the invisible, taut line that had connected them for 3 years. He stepped down from the dais, his heavy boots crunching against the dried reeds on the floor. He walked past Freya. The draft of his passing brought a wave of that pine and iron scent, hitting the back of her throat like a physical blow. He stopped in front of Clara. Clara, her younger sister. Clara, who smelled of crushed lavender and milk. Clara, whose hands were soft and unblemished, who embroidered tapestries while Freya tracked rogue wolves through the freezing mud. Freya watched, her vision narrowing to a tunnel as Garrick draped the silver and white cloak over Clara's trembling shoulders. Clara let out a tiny, frightened gasp, looking up at the towering Alpha with wide, tear-filled eyes. She looked like a trapped rabbit. She looked beautiful. She looked exactly like the docile, malleable Luna the Council of Elders had been demanding Garrick take. "I claim you, Clara of the Riverlands!" Garrick's voice boomed, deep and resonant, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "To bind my house, to bear my heirs, to be the light of my reign." The words were a rusted blade dragging across Freya's ribs. She didn't cry out. The betrayal didn't manifest as a grand, weeping sorrow. It came as a violent wave of nausea. Her mouth flooded with hot saliva. The metallic taste of a bitten tongue coated her teeth. She swallowed it down, the bile burning her throat. The crowd erupted into a deafening roar of approval. Howls tore from the throats of the lords, vibrating through the stone floor and up into Freya's boots. The noise was agonizing. Her heightened senses, already sensitive from the early stages of pregnancy, rebelled. The smell of the incense suddenly morphed into the stench of rotting flowers. She looked at Garrick one last time. He was looking down at Clara, his massive hand resting on her fragile waist. There was no joy in his expression, only a grim, crushing duty. He had chosen politics. He had chosen an unblemished womb and a politically advantageous alliance over the woman he had bled with in the dirt. He thought she would understand. He thought she would bow, step back into the shadows, and remain his loyal soldier. Perhaps even his secret whore. Freya turned away. The stone pillar was suddenly too warm, the air too thin. She pushed through the cheering throng, ignoring the elbows that jabbed her ribs and the spilled ale that splashed her skirt. Every step felt like walking through deep, freezing water. She had to get out. The pups inside her, his pups, seemed to curl into a tight, defensive knot beneath her navel. They felt like two tiny stones. She rested a hand over them, shielding them from the crushing weight of the room. He wanted heirs. He just didn't want them from her. Feast preparations meant the lower corridors of the keep were abandoned. The servants were all above, hauling trenchers of roasted meat and barrels of dark stout to feed the celebrating pack. Freya moved through the damp, torch-lit tunnels like a ghost. She didn't run. Running left a scent of panic, a sour sweat that any guard could pick up. She walked with deliberate, agonizing precision. Her bedchamber was a small, windowless cell near the armory. It smelled of saddle leather and beeswax. She closed the heavy oak door and leaned against it, closing her eyes. Silence. Finally. Then, the shaking started. It began in her knees, a violent tremor that traveled up her thighs and settled in her chest. She clamped a hand over her mouth, biting down hard on the meaty part of her palm. A single ragged sob tore its way up her throat, but she suffocated it. She refused to give him her tears. She refused to be the heartbroken maiden in a ballad. She was a fool, yes, but she was not weak. Pragmatism, cold and sharp, pushed through the haze of grief. She moved to the wooden chest at the foot of her narrow bed. She didn't pack dresses. She bypassed the silk ribbons Clara had gifted her for her name day. Instead, she reached for the bottom. Woolen tunics, sturdy leather breeches, a thick, waxed canvas cloak that smelled of old campfires. She shoved them into a canvas rucksack. Next, the armory. She unlocked her personal trunk. She took her short sword, sliding the familiar, worn leather grip into the scabbard at her hip. She packed 3 daggers, a whetstone, flint, and steel. Then she saw it. Resting on a piece of velvet was a hunting knife. The handle was carved from the bone of a winter stag, the steel folded and dark. Garrick had given it to her after they survived an ambush in the northern pass. "To guard my back," he had said, his voice a low rumble against her ear as he pressed the blade into her hand. Freya stared at it. A pathetic, romantic urge told her to leave it behind, to let him find it and feel the sting of her absence. She snorted, a harsh, ugly sound in the quiet room. Pride didn't skin rabbits. Pride didn't cut kindling. She grabbed the knife and strapped it to her thigh. The hardest part was the scent. She was a wolf. Her scent was her signature. And right now her scent was changing. The sharp, earthy smell of her was rounding out, becoming sweeter, heavier with the pheromones of carrying young. A tracker would notice the subtle shift. Garrick would notice. She went to her wash basin. She grabbed a cake of harsh lye soap, the kind used for scrubbing blood out of chainmail. She stripped off the linen dress, leaving it in a discarded heap on the floor, and began to scrub. She washed her skin until it was red and raw, scraping away the scent of the keep, the scent of the incense, the phantom scent of Garrick's touch. When she was dressed in her traveling gear, she opened a small leather pouch she kept hidden under a loose floorboard. Wolfsbane powder. Highly toxic to their kind if ingested, but incredibly effective at masking scent if rubbed into cloth. She took a pinch and rubbed it into the collar of her cloak. It burned her nose, making her eyes water, but it would confuse the hounds. She strapped the pack to her shoulders. It was heavy, but the weight felt good. It felt like reality. She slipped out the servants' postern gate just as the midnight storm broke. The sky tore open, dumping freezing rain onto the cobblestones. It was a miserable, bone-chilling deluge. To Freya it was a blessing. The rain would wash away whatever scent the wolfsbane didn't cover. It would turn the dirt roads to impassable mud. She didn't look back at the keep. The towering stone walls, illuminated by flashes of lightning, looked like a cage she had barely escaped. She pulled the heavy waxed hood over her head and stepped into the thick, sucking mud of the King's Road. By dawn, her boots were waterlogged, her thighs chafed raw, and her stomach cramped with a vicious, empty hunger. The adrenaline of the escape was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. She pulled off the road, pushing deep into the dense, tangled undergrowth of the blackwood pines. She found a hollow beneath the roots of a massive, overturned oak. It smelled of wet earth, decaying leaves and worms. It was cramped, damp, and filthy. Freya curled her tall frame into the small space, pulling her knees to her chest. She wrapped the cloak tightly around herself, shivering violently as the wet cold seeped into her bones. She rested her raw, blistered hands over her stomach. "Just us," she whispered into the dark, her voice cracking. "Just us." The rain pounded against the thick roots above her. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since Garrick had walked past her, she let a single, hot tear carve a path through the grime on her cheek. Then she wiped it away, smearing mud across her face, and forced herself to sleep. 3 weeks. Time didn't exist in days anymore. It existed in degrees of misery. It existed in the hollow ache in Freya's gut, the throbbing of her blistered heels, and the ever-present, terrifying paranoia that the wind was carrying the scent of Garrick's hunters. She had pushed relentlessly north, moving parallel to the King's Road, but never stepping foot on it. The terrain had shifted from rolling, forested hills to jagged, unforgiving borderlands. The trees grew twisted and stunted here, fighting against the harsh winds that swept down from the ice-capped mountains. Freya knelt in the slush of a melting snowdrift, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She was a miserable sight. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. Her thick hair was matted with twigs and dried mud. She smelled of unwashed wool, pine needles, and the distinct, coppery tang of old blood from skinning small game. She carefully pulled apart a snare she had set the night before. Empty. The wire was bent, meaning something had fought its way out. She cursed, dropping her head. The hunger was no longer just an ache. It was a living, clawing entity inside her. She wasn't just feeding herself anymore. The twins were demanding. They were alpha blood, incredibly strong, draining her reserves with frightening speed. Her clothes were becoming tight across her middle, the undeniable swell of her belly a constant reminder of the life she was stealing away. She stood up too fast. The world tilted, black spots swarming her vision. She braced a hand against a frozen birch trunk, gasping as a wave of dizziness washed over her. "Weak," a voice whispered in her head. It sounded infuriatingly like Garrick. "You can't survive the winter alone. A rogue pregnant female is a dead female." "Shut up!" she hissed through chattering teeth, gripping the tree bark until it dug beneath her nails. She forced her legs to move. She needed shelter. The wind was picking up, carrying the bitter scent of ozone and incoming snow. If she was caught in the open during a blizzard, the cold would take the pups before morning. By late afternoon, the grey sky had bruised into a deep, stormy purple. Snowflakes the size of coins began to fall, settling on her eyelashes and melting down her neck. She was moving entirely on instinct, her wolf pushing her human form forward when her muscles screamed for rest. Through the dense veil of falling snow, she saw a shape, too square to be a rock formation. She drew Garrick's bone-handled knife, her hand trembling slightly from cold and exhaustion. She approached slowly, the snow muffling her footsteps. It was a structure, an old crofter's hut, built of stacked stone and thick, rotting turf. The roof had partially caved in, and the wooden door hung drunkenly on a single rusted hinge. She flared her nostrils, pulling the freezing air deep into her lungs. No scent of smoke, no scent of wolf, just the smell of wet decay, old ash, and the faint, musky odor of rodents. Freya slipped inside. It was dark, the only light filtering through the hole in the roof and the cracks in the walls. The floor was packed earth, littered with animal droppings and dead leaves. In the center sat a crude stone hearth. It was a palace. She dropped her pack against the far wall and slumped to the floor, her legs finally giving out. She sat in the dirt, breathing hard, listening to the wind howl outside the stone walls. It sounded like a pack of hunting dogs. She shivered, pulling her knees up. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach. She felt a distinct, sharp flutter. Not a rumble of hunger, but a movement. A kick. Freya sucked in a breath, her eyes widening in the gloom. She pressed her palm firmer against the swell. A moment later, another thump, right against her hand. Strong, aggressive. A bitter, twisted smile touched her cracked lips. Feisty, she murmured. Like your father. The thought of Garrick didn't bring tears this time. It brought a flash of hot, sustaining anger. He was probably sitting in his warm hall, a heavy chalice of wine in his hand, a roaring fire at his back. Clara would be sitting beside him, smelling of lavender, looking soft and terrified. He was building his kingdom. Let him, Freya thought, her grip tightening on the hilt of her knife. Let him have his fragile queen. Let him have his politics. She looked down at her swollen belly, hidden beneath layers of filthy, damp wool. Here in the freezing dark, eating snow and raw meat, she carried the true bloodline. She carried the storm. She forced herself up. She couldn't freeze tonight. She used her boot to scrape the debris away from the hearth. She dug into her pack, pulling out a handful of dry lint she had scavenged from her own tunics and a few dry twigs she had kept tucked inside her shirt against her skin. With numb, clumsy fingers, she struck the flint against the steel. Once, twice. On the third strike, a spark caught the lint. She blew on it gently, coaxing the tiny, fragile orange ember into a flame. She fed it twigs, then larger pieces of broken wood she pulled from the rotting roof beams. As the fire crackled to life, throwing dancing shadows against the rough stone walls, Freya peeled off her soaked cloak. She sat close to the flames, letting the heat thaw her frozen skin. The smell of burning wood and her own wet, unwashed scent filled the small space. She wasn't a lady of the court. She wasn't a soft, malleable Luna. She was a survivor. And she was going to turn these pups into monsters that would make the Alpha King tremble, even if he never knew they existed. Frost crept up the inner walls of the crofter's hut, thick and white like a fungal growth. It claimed the stone, inch by relentless inch, until the air inside the small shelter sparkled with floating ice crystals. Winter did not roar. It starved. Freya sat near the pitiful fire, her knees splayed wide to accommodate the massive, ungainly bulk of her stomach. She was 7 months along, maybe 8. Without the moon ceremonies of the pack, She had lost exact track of time. Her body, once a tightly coiled instrument of muscle and speed, now felt alien. Her center of gravity pitched her forward. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, ceaseless grinding sensation, and her ankles had swollen over the tops of her leather boots. She held Garrick's bone-handled knife over the flames, turning the blade until the steel hissed. With meticulous, agonizing care, she pressed the hot flat of the metal against a deep, festering scratch on her forearm. A parting gift from a desperate wolverine she had fought over a frozen rabbit carcass 2 days prior. The stench of burning hair and singed flesh filled the hut. Freya bit down on a strip of cured leather, a low, guttural vibration rattling in her chest. Her eyes watered, blurring the firelight. She held the iron there until the wound sealed into a blackened blister, then dropped the knife into the dirt. Spitting the leather from her mouth, she dragged a ragged breath of freezing air into her lungs. "Stay quiet," she muttered, resting her calloused, soot-stained hands on her belly. The twins were agitated. The sudden spike in her heart rate and the surge of adrenaline from the burn made them kick violently against her ribs. It felt as though they were trying to claw their way out through her organs. "I need you to sleep. Just sleep." She had nothing left to feed them today. The rabbit was gone, the bones cracked and boiled for marrow, the broth choked down hours ago. Her stomach was an empty, echoing cavern. If she shifted into her wolf form, the dense winter coat would protect her from the lethal cold. She could run faster, smell prey buried deep beneath the snow crust. But the shift was a violent, bone-breaking process. Midwives back in the territory warned that shifting late in a pregnancy could crush the pups or trap them half-formed between human and wolf. She couldn't risk it. She was trapped in her weak, hairless human skin, relying solely on crude snares and the agonizingly slow tracking skills of a bipedal hunter. She pushed herself up from the floor. It took 3 tries. Her joints popped, stiff and inflamed from the damp cold. She wrapped her torn wolfsbane-scented cloak around her shoulders, securing it with a length of rough twine. She picked up her makeshift spear, a thick branch of ash wood she had sharpened and hardened in the fire. Stepping outside was like walking into a solid wall of ice. The wind stripped the warmth from her cheeks instantly, freezing the moisture in her nostrils. The forest was a skeletal wasteland of black trunks and blinding white drifts. She walked for miles, her snowshoes, fashioned from bent willow branches and strips of rabbit hide, keeping her from sinking into the waist-deep powder. Every step required calculated effort. Lift, push, settle, breathe. A faint scent hit her palate. She stopped, closing her eyes, letting her heightened senses isolate the smell from the overwhelming metallic tang of the snow. Musky, faintly sweet, warm blood. Deer. Freya moved against the wind, her spear gripped so tightly her knuckles shone white beneath the grime. She found the tracks an hour later, deep, uneven hooves punching through the crust. The stride was irregular, a dragging back leg. Injured, slow. Predatory hunger flared in her chest, a primal, undeniable heat that momentarily banished the freezing air. She followed the trail down into a ravine, moving with terrifying silence for a woman carrying the weight of 2 unborn pups. She found the buck trapped in a thicket of frozen brambles, its back leg caught in the twisted, thorny vines. It was a young male, its ribs stark and visible beneath a patchy winter coat. It thrashed weakly as Freya approached, its large, dark eyes rolling in terror. She didn't feel pity. Pity was a luxury for courtiers eating roasted pheasant on silver platters. Freya stepped close, driving the ash spear forward with a sharp, brutal thrust. The wood pierced the thick hide of the buck's neck, severing the artery. The animal bucked once, a spray of bright, steaming crimson painting the white snow, and then collapsed. She dropped the spear and fell to her knees beside the dying animal, The heat radiating from its body was intoxicating. Before the buck's chest had even stopped rising, she drew her knife and sliced a clean line down its belly. Her hands were coated in hot, sticky blood. She didn't wait to haul the carcass back to the hut. She carved out a slab of dark, raw meat from the flank and shoved it into her mouth. She chewed mechanically, the coppery, iron-rich taste flooding her tongue, coating her throat. It was tough and warm. It tasted like life. She ate until the hollow ache in her stomach subsided into a heavy, nauseating fullness. Then she began the grueling work of butchering the rest. By the time she dragged the heavy, hide-wrapped bundle of meat back to the stone hut, night had fallen. The temperature had plummeted further. Her hands were numb blocks of ice. The blood dried and cracked like dark paint across her skin. She barricaded the heavy wooden door, rekindled the fire, and collapsed beside it. She was exhausted down to the marrow of her bones, trembling so hard her teeth clicked together. But as she laid her hand over her stomach, the kicks were slower, calmer, satiated. "I told you," she whispered into the empty, freezing room, her voice hoarse. "I'll keep you alive. Let him have his warm keep. We have the woods." She closed her eyes, the smell of raw meat and wood smoke clinging to her skin, and slept with the blood still staining her hands. Spring did not arrive with blooming flowers or singing birds. It arrived as a rotting, muddy slog. The snowmelt turned the forest floor into a sucking, treacherous swamp. The roof of the crofter's hut leaked constantly, dripping freezing, dirty water onto the packed earth floor. The smell of decay was everywhere. Dead leaves, thawed carcasses of animals that hadn't survived the freeze, and the overwhelming, suffocating scent of wet earth. Freya felt the first contraction just as the grey dawn broke through the cracks in the stone walls. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a vicious, sharp seizing of her entire abdomen, as if a giant hand had reached inside her and squeezed her organs. She gasped, dropping the armful of damp firewood she had been carrying. The logs clattered into the mud outside the door. She gripped the rotting door frame, her knuckles white, her breath hissing out in a sharp, panicked rhythm. "No!" she gritted out, staring out at the desolate, dripping forest. "Not yet. I don't have the pelts cured. I don't have enough water." The babies didn't care about her preparations. A second contraction hit, harder than the first, driving her to her knees in the cold mud. A warm, terrifying rush of fluid soaked through her woolen breeches. Her water had broken. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her hardened exterior. She dragged herself over the threshold, kicking the door shut behind her. The hut was dark and damp. She crawled toward the hearth, her breathing ragged and loud in the enclosed space. She had stockpiled dry moss and ripped strips of linen from her old tunics, piling them in the corner. She dragged herself to the makeshift nest, collapsing onto the rough, scratchy material. There was no midwife to offer her ice chips or cool cloths. There was no healer to administer pain-dulling herbs. There was no alpha pacing the halls, waiting to roar his approval at the continuation of his line. There was only the dripping of water from the ceiling and the rapid, terrified thumping of her own heart. The pain intensified quickly, stripping away her humanity layer by layer. By midday, the contractions were crashing over her in relentless, agonizing waves. Freya writhed on the moss, her hands clawing at the dirt floor until her fingernails tore and bled. She bit her own lip until it split, tasting copper, screaming into the empty room. The sound was not human. It was the high, keening howl of a trapped animal in excruciating pain. Garrick. The name surfaced in her delirious mind, a momentary pathetic flare of weakness. She wanted his massive, warm hand gripping hers. She wanted his deep, resonant voice rumbling against her ear, telling her to breathe. She hated herself for the thought. She forced the image of him at the altar, cloaking Clara in silver fur to the forefront of her mind. She used the sting of that betrayal to fuel her anger. Anger was better than fear. Anger gave her strength. "Get out!" She screamed at her own body, bearing down with a raw, guttural roar that tore her vocal cords. The pressure was unbearable, a tearing, burning sensation that threatened to rip her in half. She pushed until black spots swarmed her vision, until the blood vessels in her eyes burst, turning the whites a terrifying, bloodshot red. With a final, agonizing push, the pressure suddenly gave way. A slippery, wet weight dropped onto the moss between her legs. Freya collapsed backward, her chest heaving, her vision swimming. For a terrifying second, there was silence. Then a sharp, angry wail pierced the damp air of the hut. She forced herself up on shaking elbows. A boy, he was covered in blood and vernix, his tiny fists waving blindly in the cold air. Trembling uncontrollably, Freya reached down. She used Garrick's hunting knife, sterilized in the fire hours ago, to sever the cord. She wiped the mucus from the infant's mouth and nose with a piece of dirty linen. She pulled him to her bare chest, wrapping him in a piece of rabbit skin. He was so hot, he felt like a burning coal against her clammy, freezing skin. But there was no time to rest. The second contraction seized her again, immediately. "Wait," she sobbed, clutching the newborn boy to her breast. "Just wait a moment." The second birth was faster, but no less brutal. 10 minutes later, a second cry joined the first. A girl, smaller than her brother, but her lungs were just as powerful. Freya cut the second cord, her hands slick with her own blood. She gathered the tiny, squalling girl, pulling her up against her chest alongside the boy. She wrapped her heavy, waxed cloak entirely around the three of them, creating a dark, warm cocoon. She lay back against the dirt wall, utterly depleted. She was bleeding heavily, her muscles twitching with exhaustion. She smelled of iron, sweat, and the sharp, milky scent of new life. Inside the cocoon of the cloak, the crying slowly subsided into snuffling, seeking movements. Freya looked down at them in the dim light. The boy had stopped crying and was staring up at her. His eyes were open. Freya's breath caught in her throat. Wolf pups were born blind. Human babies had dark, unfocused eyes. The boy's eyes were already focusing, and they were a striking, luminous, terrifying shade of gold. Alpha eyes. She looked at the girl. She was asleep, but even in the shadows, Freya could see the faint, dark down covering the tops of her tiny ears. These weren't just the king's bastards. These were full-blooded, dominant wolves. The ancient blood of Garrick's bloodline ran so thick in them that it was manifesting hours after birth. If the Council of Elders ever saw them, they would steal them. They would kill Freya and take the twins to be raised as the rightful heirs, pushing Clara's future children aside. Freya brushed a blood-stained thumb over the boy's cheek. He rooted against her finger, his tiny mouth opening. "Cade," she whispered, her voice rough like sandpaper. She looked at the sleeping girl. And Lyra. She pulled them tighter against her chest, a fierce, terrifying possessiveness locking around her heart like a steel vault. The anger, the betrayal, the fear of the winter. It all evaporated, replaced by a singular, blinding purpose. She was no longer a discarded lover. She was no longer a runaway scout. She was the mother of monsters, and she would tear the throat out of anyone, king, elder, or beast, who tried to take them from her. Raw meat and sour milk permanently stained the cracked leather of Freya's tunic. The first year of the twins' lives did not pass. It dragged her over a bed of broken glass. Human infants were helpless, soft things that required swaddling and gentle rocking. Cade and Lyra were different. The alpha blood in their veins was an aggressive, undeniable fire, demanding fuel that Freya's hollowed-out body struggled to provide. By the time the autumn leaves began to rot into the freezing mud, Cade already had his first set of teeth. They were needle-sharp, slightly translucent, and devastating. Freya sat on a damp bed of pine needles inside the deep limestone cave she had claimed after abandoning the crofter's hut. The wind howled outside, a constant grating drone. Lyra slept in a tight ball against Freya's thigh, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rapid canine rhythm. Cade was nursing. He latched with a brutal, starving intensity. A sudden piercing agony shot through Freya's breast. She gasped, her entire body jerking backward. Cade had bitten down, hard enough to draw blood. Instinct, dark and immediate, bypassed her human motherly affection. Freya's lips curled back from her teeth. A low, vibrating snarl tore from her throat, a sound of absolute, dominant warning. She grabbed the scruff of Cade's neck with one rough hand, detaching him and pinning him gently but firmly against the stone floor. Cade didn't cry. His luminous golden eyes locked onto hers. He bared his tiny blood-flecked teeth, a pathetic but genuine growl answering hers. He was challenging her. At 4 months old, her son was testing the pack hierarchy. Freya's heart fractured. A human mother would have cooed, would have rocked him, and offered a soothing song. Freya leaned down until her nose was an inch from his. She deepened her snarl, forcing her scent to spike with pure, unyielding authority. She held him there in the freezing dirt until his small body went limp, until he averted his golden eyes and exposed the soft, vulnerable skin of his throat in submission. Only then did she release him. She scooped his trembling body into her arms, pressing her face into his sparse, dark hair. She tasted salt and realized she was weeping silently. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the dark, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry, little wolf, but out here weakness is meat." They were growing too fast. By their first winter, they were walking. By the spring, they were running on all fours, their bodies occasionally blurring with the involuntary half-shifts of pups struggling to contain the beast inside them. They didn't speak words. They communicated in yips, growls, and sharp, demanding barks. Freya realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that she was not raising royal heirs. She was raising feral beasts. The turning point came during the thaw. Freya was down at the swollen river, scrubbing the stench of urine and old blood from their sleeping furs. She had left the twins securely blocked inside the cave with heavy boulders. A shift in the wind hit her like a physical blow. Rot, desperation, disease, a rogue. Freya dropped the heavy furs into the churning water, her spine snapping straight. She drew Garrick's bone-handled knife, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sprinted up the steep, muddy embankment, her boots slipping, her breath burning in her lungs. She heard the scratching before she saw it. A massive, emaciated male wolf was digging frantically at the boulders blocking the cave entrance. Patches of its fur were missing, revealing weeping, infected sores. It was starving, driven mad by the scent of fresh, tender meat inside. Inside the cave, Lyra was shrieking, a high, panicked sound that severed the last thread of Freya's humanity. Freya didn't yell. She didn't warn the rogue. She launched herself off a moss-slicked fallen log, crashing onto the beast's back. The rogue snarled, twisting violently. Its jaws clamped down on Freya's forearm, the teeth sinking through the boiled leather and biting deep into her muscle. The pain was blinding, a sickening crunch of bone scraping against enamel. Freya didn't pull away. Pulling away tore the flesh. Instead, she drove her weight forward, pinning the massive wolf to the dirt. She drove the hunting knife up, under the rib cage, aiming for the heart. The blade hit bone, snapping at the hilt. The rogue bucked, throwing her off. It lunged for her throat, its jaws snapping inches from her jugular. Survival was no longer a thought. It was a pure, visceral reaction. Freya let her wolf surface, her vision tinted red. Her jaw unhinged slightly, her canine teeth lengthening, tearing through her own gums. She caught the rogue by the thick fur of its neck with her bare hands, pulling its head down and sank her own teeth directly into its jugular. Hot, foul-tasting blood flooded her mouth. The rogue thrashed, its claws shredding the front of her tunic, ripping hot lines of agony across her stomach. Freya held on. She clamped her jaws tighter, violently shaking her head, ripping the throat entirely open. The heavy body went limp beneath her. Freya spat a mouthful of blood and fur onto the mud. She stayed on her hands and knees, panting, staring at the ruined corpse. Her arm was bleeding heavily, her stomach sliced open in 3 parallel lines. She crawled to the cave entrance and pushed the boulders aside with shaking, blood-slicked hands. Cade and Lyra sat in the dirt, their eyes wide. They didn't look terrified. They looked at the dead rogue, and then they looked at their mother, kneeling in the mud, dripping with gore, her eyes blazing with feral, unhinged, protective fury. Cade toddled forward. He didn't reach for her face. He reached out and dipped his small fingers into the pool of blood spreading from the rogue's neck, then brought it to his mouth. Freya closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cold stone of the cave wall. She had kept them alive. But she had lost whatever part of them was human in the process. 5 winters forged the twins into something the world had never seen. They were not children. They were apex predators wearing the skin of 6-year-olds. Freya crouched on the thick, mossy branch of an ancient cedar, perfectly still. Below her, the forest floor was a tapestry of dappled sunlight and deep shadows. She watched the clearing with the cold, detached patience of a seasoned hunter. A large, fat wood grouse pecked obliviously at the base of a rotting stump. From the thicket to the left, a shadow detached itself. Lyra. She moved with a fluid, terrifying silence. Her dark hair was hacked short with a knife to keep the ticks out, her face smeared with mud to break up her pale skin. She didn't walk. She stalked, her body slung low to the ground. On the opposite side of the clearing, the underbrush rustled faintly. The grouse jerked its head up, alarmed. It took 2 steps toward Lyra's hiding spot. Instantly, Cade burst from the bushes behind the bird. He was massive for his age, his shoulders already broad, his face set in a permanent, brooding scowl. He didn't use a weapon. He lunged, his hands closing around the grouse's neck with a sickening, definitive snap. The bird didn't even have time to flutter. Lyra stood up, trotting over to her brother. She nudged his shoulder with hers, a silent gesture of pack unity, and took the bird. They had coordinated the ambush perfectly. The distraction, the trap, the execution. Freya dropped silently from the branch, her boots absorbing the impact. The twins turned to her, their luminous golden eyes glowing in the forest gloom. They held the kill out to her. The alpha gets the first bite. Freya nodded, taking the bird. Good, she murmured. Her voice was raspy, unused to forming full sentences. They rarely spoke. Words were loud. Words drew attention. She began to pluck the feathers, but a sudden, violent shift in the breeze made her freeze. She inhaled deeply, opening her mouth slightly to let the scent wash over her palate. It cut through the familiar smells of pine, damp earth, and grouse blood like a rusted sword. Wood smoke, not the faint, localized smell of a lone trapper's fire. This was a heavy, confident burn. Sizzling salt pork, oiled leather, forged steel, and beneath it all, the sour, aggressive musk of kennel-fed warhounds. King's scouts. Freya's blood ran cold. They were deep in the unmarked territories, leagues north of the established borders. Garrick's men had never pushed this far into the deep woods. She dropped the bird. "Hide!" she hissed, using the sharp, guttural tone that meant absolute obedience. Cade and Lyra didn't question her. They didn't look scared. They simply vanished, melting backward into the dense ferns with unnerving speed. Freya drew her short sword. She rubbed a handful of wild mint and wet dirt over her clothes, masking the scent of the fresh kill, and moved toward the smoke. She found the camp nestled in a rocky ravine 2 miles south. There were 5 men, They wore heavy boiled leather armor stamped with the roaring bear crest of the Alpha King. Two massive scarred mastiffs lay chained to a deeply driven iron spike, gnawing on massive bones. Freya crept to the edge of the ravine, pressing her belly into the damp moss behind a cluster of granite boulders. "Ah, pointless freezing our stones off out here," one of the scouts grumbled, poking the fire with a stick. He had a jagged scar running down his cheek. "There's nothing out here but rogues and starvation." "King's orders," a second man replied, uncorking a leather flask. "He wants the northern perimeter expanded. Every cave checked, every rogue camp burned." "Why the sudden push?" the scarred man asked, taking the flask. "He's been sitting quiet for 5 years. Why poke the hornets now?" The second man leaned in, lowering his voice. Freya strained her ears, her wolf hearing isolating the whisper over the crackle of the fire. "Because the queen's pup is weak," he muttered. 4 years old and he hasn't spoken a word. Shivers at loud noises. The healers say his bones are brittle. The council is whispering. They say Clara's blood is too thin to hold the king's dominance. A vicious, ugly spike of triumph shot through Freya's chest. Weak. Garrick had traded her for a soft, unblemished womb, and he had gotten a fragile, broken heir. "So the king is looking for an outlet," the scarred man concluded. "Conquest to hide the failure at home." "Exactly. So keep your eyes open. If we find a good defensible ridge, we mark it for the garrison." Freya backed away slowly, her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. They weren't just passing through, they were looking to build a garrison. They were going to bring logging camps, soldiers, and hundreds of hounds right to her doorstep. They would find the cave. They would find the twins. And if they saw the golden eyes of her feral son, they would know exactly whose blood ran in his veins. One of the mastiffs suddenly stopped chewing. It lifted its massive, blocky head, its nostrils flaring. It stared directly at the cluster of granite boulders where Freya was hiding. A deep, rumbling growl vibrated in the dog's chest. "What is it, Brutus?" the scarred man asked, reaching for his crossbow. Freya didn't hesitate. She couldn't run. The hounds would track her scent back to the twins. She slipped a throwing dagger from her thigh sheath. As the scout unchained the dog to let it investigate, Freya stood up from behind the boulder. The scout shouted in surprise, raising the crossbow. Freya threw the dagger. It buried itself to the hilt in the man's throat. He collapsed backward, a gurgling, wet sound escaping his lips. The mastiff lunged, 150 pounds of muscle and teeth launching straight at her. Freya dropped low, sliding under the dog's leap. As the beast passed over her, she drove her short sword up, burying the blade deep into its unprotected belly, ripping backward to open it from sternum to groin. Blood and viscera rained down on her. The dog hit the ground behind her, dead before it stopped sliding. The camp erupted into chaos. The remaining 3 men drew their swords, yelling commands. The second dog strained violently against its chain, barking frantically. Freya didn't stay to fight. She had silenced the immediate tracker. She spun and sprinted into the dense timber, using the shadows and the rough terrain to lose them. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead, circling wide before finally returning to the spot where she had left the twins. They were exactly where she had ordered them to stay, hidden beneath the roots of a massive oak. When she approached, covered in fresh blood and reeking of dog, they crawled out. Cade sniffed her hand, his nose wrinkling at the bitter smell of the mastiff. Lyra looked up at her, her golden eyes asking the question neither of them had the words to speak. Freya knelt in the dirt, pulling them both tightly against her chest. The world was shrinking. The king was pushing his borders, desperate for the strength he had thrown away. "We have to go deeper," Freya whispered into the rough hair of her children. "The king is looking for monsters, and he has no idea what he's about to find." Ash rained down on the jagged peaks like grey, suffocating snow. Garrick's commanders, tired of losing their best trackers to the shadows of the unmarked territories, had resorted to the oldest, crudest tactic of war. They were burning the forest out. Freya choked on a lungful of acrid smoke, pressing a ragged strip of linen over Lyra's nose and mouth. The heat pushing up from the valley was immense, baking the moisture right out of the soil. The sky was bruised purple and black, lit from below by an angry, crawling orange glow. The scent of roasted pine sap, burning moss, and the terrified panic of fleeing game saturated the heavy air. "Keep moving," Freya rasped, her voice a dry rattle. Cade scrambled up the loose, treacherous shale ahead of them, his hands and feet slipping before finding purchase on the jagged slate. He didn't complain. He didn't cry from the burning in his eyes. He just climbed, his small, heavily muscled body moving with the terrifying efficiency of a mountain cat. They had been climbing for 2 days, pushed entirely out of the timberline and into the desolate, unforgiving rock formations of the high country. There was no shelter here, no game, just biting wind and unforgiving stone. A sharp, barking yelp echoed off the canyon walls below. Freya froze. The sound cut through the roar of the distant fires. Hounds! They had breached the smoke line. She turned, grabbing Lyra by the scruff of her tunic and hauling her up onto a narrow ledge. "Stay behind me." Cade dropped back down to the ledge, taking a defensive stance beside his mother's knee. His lips curled back, exposing his elongated canines. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest, a sound far too deep for a 6-year-old boy. From the smoke-choked ravine, figures began to emerge. First, the hounds, 3 massive, leather-armored brutes, their jaws slavering, pulling hard against heavy iron chains. Behind them came the handlers, and then a line of heavily armored guards carrying crossbows. They wore the silver and black colors of the capital. Freya drew her broken short sword. The jagged edge of the snapped blade glinted dully in the hellish light. She was trapped on a ridge with a sheer drop to her left, and an impassable cliff face to her right. The soldiers spread out in a semicircle, their boots crunching on the loose shale. They leveled their crossbows, the heavy mechanical clicks of the winches ratcheting into place, echoing off the rocks. "Drop the weapon, rogue!" the captain shouted, stepping forward. He held a thick chain, a black hound snarling at the end of it. "By order of the Alpha King, submit to the irons or be shot where you stand." Freya didn't lower the sword. She flared her nostrils. Through the thick, choking scent of the ash and the sour sweat of the soldiers, a new scent pierced the air. It was a smell she hadn't encountered in 6 years, a scent that still possessed the agonizing power to make her heart stutter in her chest. Crushed mint, pine needles, the rusted iron tang of absolute dominance. The line of soldiers parted. Garrick stepped to the front. He was massive, clad in heavy plate and dark furs, the crown of the unified pax resting against his brow. But time and stress had not been kind to him. The warm amber of his eyes had dulled to a flat, exhausted yellow. Deep lines carved brackets around his mouth, and silver threads prematurely shot through his dark beard. He looked like a man carrying a collapsing house on his shoulders. He didn't look at her face at first. He looked at the ragged, mud-caked clothes, the bare, blistered feet, the broken sword. He saw another feral rogue to be purged from his borders. "You've cost me 7 good men," Garrick said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the soles of Freya's boots. The sound of it unlocked a sickening, contradictory wave of heat in her lower belly. Her body still recognized its mate, even as her mind screamed for his blood. 7 men who crossed into my territory. Freya replied. Her voice was ruined, raspy, harsh, unused to the soft inflections of the court. But the cadence, the sharp, defiant bite of her tone, acted like a physical blow. Garrick flinched. He stopped walking. His head snapped up, his dull yellow eyes suddenly sharpening, focusing on her face beneath the layers of soot, dirt, and dried blood. He stared at the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the familiar, defiant tilt of her chin. The iron scent rolling off him spiked with sudden violent shock. Freya! The name left his lips like a desperate, exhaled prayer. The crossbowmen shifted uneasily, glancing at their king. The king shouldn't wander so far from his warm hearth. Freya spat, a grip tightening on the hilt of her ruined sword. The ash will ruin your fine furs. Garrick took a step forward, his heavy boots crushing the slate. His hands, clad in steel gauntlets, trembled visibly. You're dead. The trackers said you drowned in the spring floods. We found a torn cloak downriver. A wolf's bane trick, she said coldly. To keep your hounds away. It seems it finally wore off. He stared at her, taking in the scars lacing her forearms, the feral, hollowed-out wildness in her eyes. The guilt radiating off him was thick enough to taste. He smelled of sorrow, of bitter, aged regret. Why? Garrick demanded, his voice breaking. He stepped closer, ignoring the broken sword pointed at his chest. Why run? You could have stayed. You were my best scout. You were my... Your secret in the dark? Freya interrupted, her voice cracking like a whip. Your dirty little secret to keep your bed warm while you paraded a pure, soft queen in front of your council. I chose not to be a shadow in your kingdom, Garrick. I chose the mud. Clara's boy is weak, Garrick blurted out, the confession tearing from him in a moment of pure, shattered vulnerability. He's frail. The bloodline is failing. The council plots against me. Every day is a battle to hold the packs together. I needed strength, Freya. I thought... He trailed off as a small pebble skittered down the rock face. Garrick's eyes flicked downward, past the edge of Freya's ruined sword, into the shadows just behind her legs. Lyra stepped forward, peering around her mother's thigh. She was covered in ash, her dark hair chopped short, a bloody rabbit bone tied into a leather cord around her neck. Garrick's breath hitched. He saw the dark hair. He saw the structure of the jaw. Then Cade stepped in front of his sister, placing himself squarely between the Alpha King and his mother. Cade didn't look like a human child. He stood in a deep, defensive crouch, his hands curled into claws, his chest heaving. And as he stared up at the towering armored king, his eyes caught the light of the burning valley below. They were luminous, burning gold. The undeniable, absolute mark of dominant alpha blood. Silence slammed down on the ridge. The soldiers held their breath. Even the mastiffs stopped pulling at their chains, whining softly as they caught the scent of the terrifying, raw power radiating from the 5-year-old boy. Garrick dropped to his knees. The heavy steel plates of his armor crashed against the rock. He stared at the boy, at the girl, at the undeniable, impossible truth standing right in front of him. Twins, Garrick whispered, tears spilling over his ash-streaked cheeks. By the gods, you carried my pups. You took my heirs. They are not your heirs, Freya said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. She didn't move an inch. They do not know what a king is. They know how to skin a buck before the blood cools. They know how to snap a tracker's neck in the dark. They are not princes, Garrick. They are monsters. Garrick reached a shaking, gauntleted hand out toward Cade. Son, he choked out. He flooded the air with the crushing, overwhelming pheromones of an alpha command. It was a scent designed to force any wolf in the pack to bare their throat in submission. The soldiers behind him immediately dropped their gazes, their shoulders slumping under the weight of his power. Freya gritted her teeth, fighting the overwhelming biological urge to kneel. Cade didn't kneel. The boy's golden eyes flared with sudden, unhinged fury. He didn't recognize the command. He only recognized an attack. Cade let out a vicious, bone-chilling roar, a sound that echoed off the jagged peaks like a crack of thunder. He lunged forward, swiping his small, dirty hand at Garrick's outstretched arm. The boy's blunt nails scraped against the steel gauntlet with enough force to leave deep, visible gouges in the metal. Garrick jerked his hand back, staring at the scratches in absolute, horrified awe. The boy was 5, yet his raw physical strength was already rivaling that of a grown warrior. "They submit to no one," Freya said, stepping forward and placing a firm, stabilizing hand on Cade's shoulder. The boy instantly stopped snarling, leaning his weight against her leg, his eyes never leaving Garrick. "Not even you. They are my blood," Garrick growled, the Alpha King finally clawing his way back through the despair. He looked up at her, his jaw setting. "They belong in the capital. They belong on the dais. You made your choice at the altar." Freya said softly. The anger was gone now, replaced by an icy, impenetrable calm. "You chose the politics. You chose the safety of the council's approval. You bound yourself to Clara, and you built a kingdom of glass. Let it shatter. I will not let you walk away with them," Garrick warned, rising slowly to his feet. He rested a hand on the hilt of his broadsword. "I have 50 men behind me. You cannot fight us all." "I don't have to," Freya replied. She let out a short, sharp whistle. From the high, inaccessible cliffs above them, a massive boulder suddenly dislodged. It crashed down the scree, gathering speed, smashing into the narrow pass the soldiers had used to climb the ridge. It triggered a localized rock slide, sending tons of jagged slate pouring down onto the trail, completely burying the path and cutting the soldiers off from the ridge. Cade and Lyra hadn't just been climbing. They had been setting traps. The soldiers shouted in panic as dust and debris filled the air. Several men were knocked backward, the hounds barking furiously in the confusion. When the dust finally began to settle, Garrick coughed, waving his arm to clear the air. He turned back toward the ledge. It was empty. Only the broken half of Freya's short sword remained, driven point first into the hard earth where she had stood. Garrick rushed to the edge of the cliff, looking down into the thick, swirling smoke of the burning valley. There was no trace of them, no scent, no footprints. They had vanished back into the wild, leaving him standing on a broken mountain with a hollow crown, a dying bloodline, and the agonizing knowledge of the feral gods he had thrown away. Will Garrick let his true heirs vanish into the mist, or is this just the beginning of a brutal war for the bloodline? The Alpha King made his choice, and now he has to live with the monsters he created. If you loved this dark, gritty take on werewolf lore, smash that like button, share this with your pack, and subscribe to catch every wild update. Drop a comment below. Did Freya do the right thing by keeping the twins a secret?